A stranger ship, a lost engineer, a haunted ship. Section 1. The Derelict's Call. The Star Jumper Spiro, an old but sturdy human deep space cargo hauler, had just completed a routine jump between sectors when the distress signal crackled to life. Senior engineer Elias Vance scowled at the console. It was an automated emergency beacon, broadcasting in an old Earth-based encryption, human. His ship was alone in the empty void between settled systems. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, yet something was calling for help. Vance frowned, running a diagnostic. The beacon was centuries old, its frequency degraded but still active. That meant only one thing. The ship it belonged to had been stranded in the void for an impossible amount of time. The idea sent a cold shiver down his spine. Vance wasn't one for ghost stories, but he knew the dangers of derelict ships. An empty ship was rarely truly empty. Pirates, failed AI, even alien infestations. There were plenty of reasons why most spacers steered clear of distress signals. But humanity had its own code. You answer the call. Captain, Vance asked, turning to his superior, Captain DeVries. DeVries was a seasoned officer, the kind of man who never let his emotions show. He studied the readings for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. We check it out. If it's salvageable, we tow it. If it's a trap, we burn hard out of there. Vance nodded. Aye, Captain. The Spiro altered course, engines humming, as it moved toward the signal source. The closer they got, the clearer the readings became. Then, out of the void, the derelict appeared. It was massive, a behemoth of old Earth engineering, its hull blackened and scarred, floating lifelessly against the stars. The name, half erased by time, read CNS Eudora, a war-era ship, a deep space exploration vessel that had vanished nearly a century ago. Impossible, whispered Parker, the ship's navigator. That ship was lost before my grandfather was even born. The bridge fell into silence. The CNS Eudora had become legend, one of the great mysteries of deep space. It had vanished on a classified mission, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions. And now, here it was, waiting for them. Vance checked his scanners. No life signs, no power, except for the beacon. Yet something fell off. The airlock is still functional, Vance reported. Magnetic clamps intact. There's even a partial atmosphere inside. That alone was odd. Most derelicts vented their oxygen long ago, either through damage or power failure. But the Eudora? It was holding on to something. Prepare a boarding team, DeVries ordered. I want a full sweep. No one goes in alone. Vance tightened his gloves, adjusting the seal on his helmet. He had spent most of his life fixing broken ships, but he had a feeling this was something different. The docking clamps extended. The airlock cycled. And as the doors slid open, revealing the darkened corridors beyond, Vance felt it for the first time. The presence of something unseen, watching them from the shadows. The Eudora was silent, but it was not empty. Section 2. Echoes in the dark. The air inside the CNS Eudora was stale, carrying the scent of rusted metal and something else, something faintly organic, like decay that had long since dried up. Vance's boots echoed unnaturally in the corridor, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the ship. The emergency lights flickered, barely illuminating the hallways. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces, yet some patches were disturbingly clean, as if something or someone had moved through recently. Vance tapped his comm captain. We've got partial atmosphere. Gravity's functional. But he hesitated, glancing at Parker, who looked just as uneasy. Something feels wrong. Stay alert. DeVries' voice came through, static laced with interference. Find the ship logs. We need to know what happened here. Vance and his team pushed forward, moving deeper into the ship. The corridors twisted in unsettling ways, as if the architecture of the Eudora had shifted over time. Every so often, Vance swore he saw movement in the periphery of his vision, shadows shifting just out of sight. "Hey, Vance," Parker muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see that?" Vance turned, following Parker's gaze to a corridor junction. The dust was disturbed, boot prints leading further inside, but there was no sign of who or what had left them. Before Vance could respond, his suit's environmental sensors pinged. Motion detected. A shiver crawled up his spine. Scan again. Confirmed that reading. Parker checked his wrist display. No life signs. Then why did the ship feel occupied? They reached the ship's command center, a large, circular bridge lined with dead consoles. Vance stepped toward the main terminal, brushing dust from the screen. He activated the manual reboot, watching as the console flickered to life. Old logs began scrolling across the screen, some corrupted beyond recognition. But one entry, time-stamped from nearly 100 years ago, was still intact. Vance played the video log. A man in a worn, high-ranking uniform appeared on the display. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion. "This is Chief Engineer Malcolm Wright of the CNS Eudora." His voice was hoarse. "We made a mistake. We thought we could control it. We were wrong. If anyone finds a ship, leave. Leave and never look back. The ship is lost. We are all lost." The recording cut to static. Vance's stomach tightened. Control what? Then the whisper came, a breath of sound over the comms, too faint to be a person but too deliberate to be static. "Elias." Vance froze. Parker stiffened beside him. The whisper had spoken his name. Before he could react, the lights flickered violently, the ship's metal frame groaning, as if something massive had just moved within its structure. A door at the far end of the bridge slammed shut, sealing them in. A warning klaxon blared across the ship, systems rebooting in erratic bursts. Vance's console flared with a new message, stark and urgent against the black screen. "Help me." Then, across the bridge, a figure stepped into view. It wore a tattered CNS Eudora uniform. Its face was human barely. Its skin was stretched too tight, its eyes hollow voids, and its mouth moved soundlessly, as if trapped between existence and nothingness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Parker grabbed Vance's arm, his breathing ragged. "We need to get out of here." Vance swallowed hard, nodding. But as they turned toward the exit, another message flashed across the screen. "Don't leave me." And the ship shuddered, as if something, somewhere deep within its structure, had just woken up. Section 3. The haunting begins. Vance and Parker staggered back as the bridge trembled. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the walls, as if the ship itself was waking up. The lights pulsed, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally. The door that had slammed shut a moment ago creaked open on its own. Vance hesitated, scanning the corridor beyond. It was the same sterile metallic hallway they had come through, yet something felt different. The angle seemed subtly off, the walls breathing in slow, rhythmic pulses. Parker gripped Vance's shoulder. "We need to go. Now." They moved cautiously into the corridor, weapons drawn. Every footstep echoed strangely, overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. The further they went, the more the air thickened, like walking through something unseen. Then Parker froze. "Vance." Vance turned, following Parker's gaze. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood in the dim light. It was Malcolm Wright, the engineer from the recording, but he wasn't human anymore. His body flickered between solid and translucent, his face twisted in a silent scream. His fingers clawed at his own skin, as if trying to peel himself out of reality. The air around him shimmered, distorting the walls, as if space itself was breaking apart. Then he spoke. "It's in the ship. It's in us." The lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed them whole. Section 4. The Descent. The emergency lamps flickered weakly to life, bathing the corridor in sickly red light. Vance's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he waved his rifle, trying to make sense of the shifting shadows. Wright was gone, but something else had taken his place. The walls groaned, as if the ship itself was stretching. The metal warped, taking on the sickly appearance of flesh, veins of liquid metal pulsing beneath its surface. "Run," Parker whispered. "Run." They bolted down the corridor, their boots hammering against the floor. The ship shuddered violently, throwing them against the walls. From behind them, the sound of skittering filled the air, something crawling through the vents, moving impossibly fast. Then a voice. "Elias, you can't leave." Vance whipped around, his pulse hammering in his throat. The whisper came from inside his helmet. Parker grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "Move!" They reached the airlock, slamming their fists against the override panel. The door refused to open. From the shadows, dozens of hollow eyes watched them. The Eudora had become something more than a ship, and it wasn't letting them go. Section 5, the final stand. The airlock remained sealed, its mechanism locked in place by some unseen force. Vance slammed his fist against the control panel, his breathing ragged. Parker was already trying to pry off the access panel, his fingers fumbling with tools as the ship groaned around them. "Override's fried," Parker muttered. "Something's controlling the system." Vance knew what that meant. The Eudora wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it didn't want them to leave. A whisper slithered through the comms, threading its way into Vance's mind. "Stay with me, Elias. We can be one." A sharp pain lanced through his skull. He gasped, stumbling back. The air around him warped, the walls bulging as though something massive was pressing from the other side. Parker grabbed him. "We need another way out." Vance forced himself to focus, pushing past the splitting headache. Escape pods. Engineering deck. They ran. Behind them, the corridor twisted, elongating unnaturally as shadows slithered along the walls. The ship was shifting, trying to lead them somewhere else. The metal beneath their boots rippled, as though they were running on the surface of a vast, living thing. Then, from the darkness, they came, the crew of the Eudora, or what was left of them. Their bodies were grotesquely altered, flesh and metal fused together in twisted, nightmarish forms. Mouths gaped open, whispering voicelessly, their hollow eyes locked onto Vance and Parker. "Move!" Vance roared, raising his weapon. They fired, the pulse rounds tearing into the horrors, but it wasn't enough. The figures shuddered, reforming even as their bodies were torn apart. The ship was keeping them alive. Parker grabbed Vance's arm. "We can't fight them. Go!" They sprinted toward the engineering deck, dodging grasping hands and flickering shadows. The corridors shifted around them, leading them in circles. Vance's chest tightened. The ship was thinking, adapting to their every move. Then he saw it, an open vent leading to the maintenance tunnels. "This way." They scrambled inside, barely squeezing through as the corridor behind them collapsed, flesh-like metal swallowing the passage in a grotesque pulse. They crawled through the tight ducts, the metal whispering against their armor. The voices of the lost crew filled the tunnels, murmuring things Vance couldn't understand. Then, a whisper he could, "You were meant to join us, Elias." A sudden force yanked Vance backward. He screamed, grabbing onto the edges of the vent as unseen hands dragged him. Parker grabbed his wrist, pulling with all his strength. Vance caught a glimpse of Malcolm right in the darkness, his form twisted and half-absorbed into the ship, his mouth opened wide, his voice an echoing plea. "Help me, or join me." Vance made his choice. He raised his weapon and fired. The blast struck Wright's form, and the creature let out a shriek of agony. The force knocked Vance loose, sending him and Parker tumbling out of the vent onto the engineering deck floor. The escape pods were ahead, but the ship wasn't done with them. The bulkhead sealed shut, cutting off their exit. The deck trembled violently, as if the ship itself was enraged. Vance sprinted to the main reactor terminal, scanning the controls. There was one way to end this. "I can overload the core," he said. "Blow the ship apart." Parker hesitated, and us with it. Vance's gaze hardened. "Not if we get to the pods in time." The terminal fought him, the ship's intelligence resisting every command. The whispering grew louder, turning into screams. Then, reactor overload initiated. A countdown appeared. 3 minutes. The ship screeched, the very walls pulsing in agony. The corrupted crew surged toward them, their bodies warping as they screamed in protest. Vance and Parker ran. The escape pods were within reach. Parker dove inside first, strapping in as Vance slammed his fist against the launch controls. The ship fought back, tendrils of metal lashing out, trying to pull him away. The ghosts of the crew howled, their faces distorting in the pod's glass. Then, just as the tendrils wrapped around his ankle, Vance punched the emergency eject. The pod launched, tearing free from the ship's grasp. The force ripped him loose, sending him tumbling into Parker's arms as they hurtled into space. Behind them, the CNS Eudora writhed, its form twisting violently as the reactor detonated. The explosion bloomed, a silent fireball in the void. The ship screamed, the voices of the lost crew wailing as they were consumed in the blast. Then, silence. Vance and Parker drifted, staring at the debris cloud that had once been the Eudora. Parker exhaled shakily. "Tell me that thing is dead." Vance stared at the wreckage, his heart still hammering. "I don't know." Then, from the radio, a final whisper slithered through the static. "Elia, I'll find you." The signal cut out, and the void swallowed them whole.